codes and standards specifically are written by governing bodies, and codes and standards, for the most part, started around the turn of the century in the industrial age.
Now, turn of the century, you mean turn of
the
1900?
19th century, yeah. As far as the Industrial Revolution, and which is funny to me because I look back to my history classes in school thinking, when am I ever going to use this? And now I teach about the Industrial Revolution and how that impacted the codes and standards that for welding and for boilers and pressure vessels. It all started in the late 1800s, when we stopped producing goods in houses and we started producing them in factories, and we started producing these boilers and pressure vessels used to heat and power all these machines and mechanics and everything that went on. And in the late 1800s, these boilers and pressure vessels, because they were all built differently, they started to explode. And that caused the American Society of Mechanical Engineers to develop the first boiler and pressure vessel code. And I believe it was adopted in like 1895, and in 1905, it was adopted across the land in all the states and was made into law. Around the same time, in the early 1900s, the American Weld Society was formed to bring standards for workmanship as far as welding and welding consumables and everything that has to do with welding. These governing bodies, at the same time, ASTM, the American Society for Testing Materials, was started to establish standards for materials. And these standards have morphed over the years, and they come out with new revisions. Some standards come out with revisions every 5 years, every 10 years, or as needed. It really depends on the governing body that is working on those standards. And those standards give us a guide for workmanship. It's a minimum line that the workmanship has to meet to be viable to that standard. Then we have specifications. Specifications are written by engineers and by purchasing agents that dictate how they want a material or an asset built. And those are going to reference back to codes and standards. So a code and standard doesn't really become relevant until it's written into the contractual documents based on the specification, which I always think is interesting because there's lots of different standards out there. There's the American Petroleum Institute standard, which is a great standard, but it's worthless if you're working on structural work, where AWS D11 standard is viable. So so these standards are our guide for how the workmanship of the asset is supposed to be built, and it's critically important. It's so important to us, to me personally, that I've gotten involved. I'm on several AWS committees that assist in writing and changing those standards. And it's a fascinating dynamic in how it works, and unfortunately, it does take time. It takes a good amount of time. I always wondered when I first started diving into these standards why it took 5 years for them to do a revision, and in this digital age, why can't we move quicker? And then I got involved in it, and I see some of the dynamics, some of the bureaucracy that goes into developing these standards, and now I understand 5 years is barely enough time. So it's pretty crazy, but that's how important we feel like standards, the codes and standards are, is that we want to get involved in helping dictate them. We want to use our industry knowledge to be able to influence them and make them stronger and get allow them to be the guide that they need to be for our industry in particular.